Greetings and welcome to our tutorial over UiPath Studio. The primary integrated development environment, or IDE, for all development done inside of UiPath. The screen that you currently see displayed at the present time is the immediate window that appears whenever you launch UiPath Studio. Hopefully this screen looks very familiar to what you're accustomed to seeing if you're at all familiar with using any of the Microsoft Office tool suites, such as Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc. From here, on this initial screen, it gives you the primary options in order to open existing projects or to potentially begin developing a new project. Over in the blue ribbon on the far left, there are several additional options in which we're about to discuss and talk about in further detail. But since we're on this current page, you will first notice on the kind of left middle column here, open, there are a couple options here that allows you to open an existing project, the very first option here, that you have saved on your local workstation. So being able to open up an existing project that you have currently saved somewhere locally on your existing either workstation or potentially off of a network drive or other immediately readily accessible location. As opposed to the second option right underneath, which says close or checkout, this would be the ability to pull an existing project off of a code repository. You'll see here it's specifically calling out Git, TFS, or SVN as being three repositories in which UiPath is able to openly and freely communicate with. Immediately below, you'll see a list that may or may not currently be on your existing environment, depending if you've opened previous applications or not. But in this case, I've got a single application called Test that I've previously worked on in this instance of UiPath Studio. So this will become an increasingly longer list here of recently open projects that provide you really a fast and easy way of being able to open up and access any of your automations that you've more recently have worked on, rather than having to go through and open up specific projects through one of the above two options that we just talked about. Moving over to the far right column here, you'll notice there are two primary options here of opening up a new project or opening up a new project from a template. Obviously, the first one here of opening up a process, this allows you to open up and begin working on a completely blank project from scratch. Absolutely nothing built except the very basic and essential fundamentals at that point. You've got additional options here of being able to publish new libraries, as well as templates for being able to, obviously what you're seeing below, begin to develop templated projects that you can immediately begin working from a pre-canned moment in time. So again, using the Office analogy here, think about building templates in Word in order to be able to utilize a document as a template, being able to quickly open up a document, fill out the pertinent details, and have a functioning document template, or excuse me, a document that you're able to utilize in more of a production state. Kind of similar capacity here within UiPath, the idea of really stubbing out an existing project where it can be easily and readily pulled in for multiple reasons downstream. Underneath the new from template, what you're seeing in the list here, and notice there's an option for more templates. The ones that are currently on the screen are your probably most common ones. These are templates that have been designed and engineered by UiPath as the organization for various reasons and causes that we're able to streamline and be able to build robust automations starting from something that has already been previously developed or engineered. The most popular or common one in this list that most likely everybody that's participating in our class here is the Robotic Enterprise Framework. We will be discussing this in a future module later on in time, so feel free to tune back into that as we progress later in the course. But the RE, or Robotic Enterprise Framework, is one of the more common templates that's frequently used within UiPath development. Going down the left side over here, starting at the top, you have a button for open, which would be similar to our open here, opening up a local project. If you click on this, you notice it immediately takes you into your common Windows dialog, open, in this case, open a workflow project, being able to open again a project that lives on your current workstation, or is readily available. So it could be potentially on a shared network drive. So I don't want to be simply saying it's on your immediate local workstation, but it's a project that you're able to get to simply by navigating to it off of a network drive potentially. Right now, you notice the close option here is grayed out. It's not immediately clickable in this current view. Had we had a project currently open, there's a button that normally would show up when we're in our normal view, and we'll see this here in a little bit. When you hit the home tab at the very top, it'll take you back to this specific screen. You've got the ability here to close down the current project that is currently in its open state. So that's why this option is grayed out. I do not have a current project currently open, so it prevents me from closing something that's not currently open. The Start tab here is the one that we've just talked through right here. This is the primary window that will appear every time UiPath Studio is initially launched. Working our way down, we've got the ability to then again get into some additional templates, similar to what we had talked about a moment ago on the start screen here. Moving to the next option further down is the option here for team. And this one, as you notice across here, allows us the ability to connect and interact with the various code repositories depending on your specific organization. You may be using Git, TFS, or the SVN repository. And at that rate, this is where you can begin again to interact with those various repositories accordingly. Moving further down is this option here for tools. One of the notable ones to call out right here, right up front, is what we call UI Explorer. As it reads here, UI Explorer is used to inspect the user interface of applications. It says opening UI Explorer from Studio context will use the UI automation libraries shipped with the current version of Studio. What I always try to say with UI Explorer is this allows us as the developer the opportunity to see the UI through the lens of, in this case, UiPath. So we get into talking about a concept known as selectors, and the selectors is exactly the eyes or vision of UiPath. It's this tool here. It's almost a second application that launches when you click this. I'll pull up UI Explorer here. UI Explorer, again, it lets us see through the lens in which UiPath sees the UI screen that's currently sitting in front of us. So to pick on an example here, I want to pull up the Windows calculator for an example. And from here, if I say indicate elements, and if I click, notice as I hover over the screen, the little gray box, kind of orange and gray box here, it's talking about the various elements, in this case, inside of calculator that I'm able to click on or interact with from what we commonly as end users see as buttons. All the buttons on the calculator are obviously the text of the results of the calculator here that I've got highlighted. This is how UiPath sees the user interface in this case. So if I want to pick on the number 5 for an example, if I click here, you notice right inside of UI Explorer, this is what we call the selector for, in this case, the button 5 of the Windows calculator. At this current moment in time, I'm not going to go into explicit detail here. We'll have a future topic and section in which to specifically talk about selectors. But long story short, again, this is how UiPath sees the button 5 on the actual user interface. So you notice it's given us this green box of saying validate. It's been valid. This is a valid selector at this point. One of the cool things of UI Explorer, if I hit the highlight button, you'll notice it now highlights the number 5. This is, again, it's almost a standalone little tool. If you look in your system tray, you'll notice UiPath Studio is open. There has also been a new icon, this little white blue dotted icon here, that will also show in the tray down at the bottom. So again, UI Explorer, kind of a separate little tool. When we get inside of Studio and begin working with some of the various activities, in this bottom right corner, you'll notice there'll be a save and cancel button. UI Explorer actually then kind of works in conjunction with Studio, and there's some interconnectivity that we'll see. We'll save that again for another future conversation. But in this current view, launching it from Studio the way we did, UI Explorer almost acts as a standalone application that, again, really allows us as the developers to see the selectors, kind of be able to poke around and see what UiPath is capable of seeing. So more commonly in the design phase of any of our automations would be a typical use of seeing UI Explorer outside of the actual activity-driven activities that you'll get into when you're actually building your automation and developing your automation. So simply calling out UI Explorer from that standpoint. A couple of the other things in here to call out and make note of: this idea of UiPath extensions. Again, we're in the tools option over here. You'll notice UiPath extensions call out Chrome, Firefox, and Edge as 3 specific extensions here. Whenever we get into developing inside of UiPath Studio, it's commonly expected that the browser of choice, if you're going to be doing any type of automation from a web browser point of view, that it's typically expected that you will always use the Internet Explorer web browser. And the primary reason behind that being that UiPath Studio and its UiPath development environment resides and lives upon what we call the .NET environment. It's Microsoft's primary development environment, and that development environment that Microsoft provides has a lot of close connectivity, and we'll call it, from a technical perspective, hooks into the Internet Explorer web browser. There's a lot of interconnectivity as to how .NET and Internet Explorer work in conjunction with one another. And with UiPath Studio being engineered upon the .NET environment, there's a lot of close, again, we're going to leverage that close connectivity of those 2 platforms, and that's where the use of IE in conjunction with Studio lives, because of that underpinning of the .NET environment, and again, its close connection back into Internet Explorer. In order to be able to use other web browsers in our automations, that's where the use of these extensions come into play. And this is where you would actually go through the ability of being able to install those various extensions, depending upon which web browser you're ultimately trying to connect to. I don't want to disregard any of these other extensions as well, but again, kind of the similar thing. If you're going to do some specific work inside of Java or Citrix, etc., here, there are additional extensions that allows for UiPath to see into those respective environments. And what I mean by being able to see into, again, kind of picking on UI Explorer, the vision of Explorer and the underpinnings of the selectors to be able to look at objects in those respective applications. Moving down to the Settings tab, this would be, again, like with any of our other Windows-based programs that we're used to utilizing. The Settings tab in this case allows us to set some of the various system level settings as it pertains to UiPath Studio. Notice we'll briefly run through some of the details here. So obviously the General tab, talking about how do you want the visual appearance of the environment to be displayed to you as the end user of, in this case, UiPath Studio. This is specific to the Studio application. Getting into design again, how do you want Studio to respond to your specific needs? So the ability to be able to do some specific customizations as it pertains to you, the developer, in specific using UiPath Studio. Moving down to location here. So if you don't make any changes here, these are obviously all default values, but again, allows us as a developer to have the ability to do some overrides and tweaking to the overall environment if so inclined. This manage sources, I'm not going to go into details of it at this specific spot, but this is an excellent opportunity to call out whenever you're inside of Studio we're going to find that there are multiple ways of accomplishing the same task. The reason why I say I'm not going to call this specific section out here is there's another spot once we get into an active project in which we can get into this ability of being able to what we call manage sources, and I'll get into the depth and detail of sources in a little bit later time in this specific video that we are currently in right now. But the idea, again, being able to have more than one way to complete a specific task. So know inside a studio, and as we go through this course, I'm going to attempt to show you one, if not two ways, with an understanding that there could potentially be 3, 4, or more ways of accomplishing the same exact task. So if I'm aware of one way, you're going to see and hear from the understanding I've got how that specific task is done. If I'm aware of a second or third option, I will try to remember to demonstrate those additional options as well. But know as I make these presentations that I may not necessarily personally know or be aware of a certain way to be able to complete a task. So you're going to hear it more from how I've learned it and the way I'm able to ultimately share and teach it with our group here. But all that just said, with managed sources, there's going to be another spot, and that's where I'm going to go into more of a depth and detail of that conversation in particular. This idea of license and profile would probably be a bit more applicable to a commercial installation of Studio, but being able to get into the details of the individual profiles and or local enterprise type licensing at that point. So in this case, with the community version that I'm currently using, there's not a lot of depth and detail here. But same thing from an end user point of view, there should not be a whole lot of need for us as individual frontline workers to get involved in this. If you are an enterprise type environment, most likely you have a team or consultant organization that is responsible for managing and maintaining all the licensing and getting the individual versions of Studio properly configured inside of your organization. Again, we've got the ability to get into several of the source control repositories. Here's an additional configuration that allows you to, obviously, in looking at here, the ability to turn on or off the various source control environments that you may be utilizing in part of your deployment of UiPath Studio. And specifically, when you're dealing with the community version, there's additional activities around labs and participating in some of the future builds of UiPath Studio. And then last but not least, working our way down the column here is the help option. This is where UiPath is trying to point to some of their specific content as it pertains to their various knowledge centers that they have readily available to the development community. One thing I always like to share here is the ability to simply go out to your favorite search engine of choice, Google, Bing, etc., and understand that when you type in UiPath and whatever it is that you might be trying to figure out how to do, there is an expansive volume of information out there at our fingertips, YouTube videos, etc., that will attempt to educate us as developers to the whichever topic may be at mind that you're ultimately trying to figure out or solve for when you're doing your development inside of UiPath. But specifically calling out a couple things in their list here. When you do a lot of those Google searches, you're going to stumble across a lot of the results point back to the community forum here that they have specifically here. The other one then being the UiPath Academy. This is actually how I personally have learned UiPath to this point. As I present the material in this course, though, what I've tried to do is improve upon what the Academy has done. Absolutely no knock of what UiPath has put together, because their library that they have within their Academy is, it truly is first class. But I would personally say if you don't come from a computer science or more technical, IT-minded experience, the Academy site can be overwhelming. It's taught more from through a technical lens or point of view. The way I try to present my material here is more within mind the non-technical users. So being able to bring folks through this experience that don't necessarily come from that technical background. So I try to use a lot of analogies and comparisons to topics that wouldn't necessarily be a technical minded topic or an idea. So I don't want to discount the Academy. It's an excellent resource, and I highly encourage everybody to go use that. But obviously, with the way I'm going to teach, a lot of what I want to share are topics that you'll also find in the Academy. So it's the ability to further extend what I'm teaching here, from a UiPath specific point of view. So I definitely highly encourage and recommend folks go there. And obviously, there's some additional detail and help reference at this point. So. All right, so at this point, we have simply talked about the main start page and all the various settings that they've got. In order to bring this thing a little bit further down the road and get into some of the specifics as it pertains to building and automation and all the various aspects of Studio inside of your actual automations, we need to begin building a new project. So in this case, I'm going to build a simple process in the top right corner. When you build a new blank process, it's going to prompt you, what do you want to call this project? What is this project going to do? This is similar to naming your Word document or saving your Excel spreadsheet, etc. It's how do you want your project to be known in the way of file name per se. Then down here under location, where do you want to actually physically save this project to? So you can see I already have a handful of projects that I've started to save here. I want to go ahead and continue on with my UiPath here. We'll simply call this Studio Demonstration. So if you haven't already done so, feel free to follow along with me here. Go ahead and create a new project called Studio Demo, if I could spell here. Studio Demo, I'm going to keep it in my default UiPath folder, but if you wanted to save to a different spot, you could. In the way of description here, you'll notice it says blank process. I'm going to update this and say providing a demo of UiPath Studio. We'll call it my first automation, which for me isn't necessarily true, but hopefully for those that are listening, hopefully this is your first automation that you've ever put together. So we're going to get your first one put together right here and now, hopefully. So if you haven't already done so, open up Studio, click on New Project as a process. Again, this is where you would want to give your project a meaningful name. Depending on your respective organization, if you're doing this commercially, your organization may have a naming convention that you need to follow here. So please follow along with your local naming conventions that your organization may be using. Same thing with where your organization may be asking that you save all of your project files to as you're going about your actual builds. And this description here is really a meaningful description as to what this project is about. If you look under my open recents here, it says test and blank process. This blank process was here because the description that I left as the default. I didn't make a change when I created this test project, and it simply says blank process here. So in this case, if I were to come back into Studio after saving this, our open recent would have a Studio demo here where it says test, and now it would say providing a demo of UiPath Studio, my first automation, where blank process currently is. So at this rate, go ahead and hit create. And all these little steps that you see it going through, it is currently building the project files that's ultimately needed for our complete automation at this point. And when you first get your project generated, this will always be the screen. Even if you're using a template, this will always be the screen that you are initially taken to upon creating a new project, either the new one like we just did, or again, if you're doing one through a template. And I'm going to now start walking us through all the various components and features of UiPath Studio that become available to us once you get inside of a project. So again, when UiPath Studio first launches, it will take you to this main splash screen here. Notice it says open main workflow here. If I were to click this link here, that would also be the equivalent, if you need to open up the project tab on the left side here, will be the equivalent of opening up this main.xaml. Speaking of main.xaml, XAML, XAML, these are the primary files that contain your actual automation. So the code that we develop inside of UiPath Studio, it's these XAML files that contain the actual code that we build. And more importantly, you'll notice it says open main workflow, and it's called main.xaml. By default, and we do have the ability to change this, but by default, especially with any new project, the main.xaml is the original source file that when you start your automation, the code begins inside of main. Main is where all code originates and begins executing from. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and open up main.xaml. Again, I could have clicked the open main workflow. When you do this, notice what comes up on the screen. This is kind of what I call our main canvas here. Think of an artist's canvas that they draw their art on. This is where we build our art in this case being our automation. All the logic that's needed to build our automated flow, whatever application flow we're trying to build or subsequently automate. This is where we paint that beautiful picture that we're going to build. So think of this as nothing more than your canvas. This is where we build all the activity. But notice here at the top it says main. This is where all of your open XAML files. So eventually we'll get into having multiple files open at a single time. That's where this list here really almost looks like little index file tabs that you'd have in a file cabinet. These you'd have, if you have multiple XAML files open at a time, all the open ones show up in kind of this little gray box here. In this case, main is the only file that we currently have open. And at this point, main contains no activities. We have not built anything into our automation yet. We will get there here in just a little bit. We will, by the time we're done with our video here, we will have a very basic but functioning automation that we're able to demo and show. Specifically going back to our project tab here, you'll notice you got your main.xaml. When we get into some of our bigger projects, you'll see there will be additional files and settings available to us here. One thing I want to call out right at the onset here is this idea of dependencies. Dependencies are, we'll call this, it's really the predefined activities that have been pre-built and brought into our automation for us. You notice all these simply say UiPath dot all the way down. These are files in which UiPath has engineered for us, and they contain all the activities, the things that UiPath can do for us. These 4 that you see here are the default 4 that will always be initially available to us in any of our future projects that we will build. These are your common 4 main activities that are frequently used in any UiPath automation. This is not an inclusive list. We'll talk about here in a little bit when we get into managed packages. We've got the ability to add additional dependencies or additional packages to our projects that, as you see here, allows us to build in additional, and it says here, custom activity feeds. So being able to bring in reusable type activities or activities that others have built for us that we're able to subsequently include in our automations. These all show up here at that point. As we talk about additional dependencies and those activities, it's an excellent time now to call out the activities tab down next to project. These are all of the activities that are currently available to us and can be brought over here into our automation. These are the actual things that we can do that allows our automation to perform. So all the logic that's needed to build an automation. This is our artist palette, if you will. These are all of our colors that we can place onto our palette to draw our pretty picture, to, in this case, build our application using, again, the artist analogy. If you're curious about what activities are out there, this is keyword searchable. But then underneath this available, it's an expanded list of all of the individual activities that are available to us to be able to invoke and incorporate into our various automations. Again, this list here is going to be contingent upon the dependencies that we pulled in. So if inside of manage packages here you add additional dependencies, you will see those additional items show up in this list right here, as well as again be keyword searchable at that point. The other thing to start calling out down here at the bottom, it's kind of hidden from view at the moment, is this ability of an output window. And if I expand this a little bit further, when I built my project, these are all the various activities that UiPath was doing, we'll say, behind the scenes in order to generate this current project that I'm currently in at the moment. When we begin running our automations, this is the window in which we're able to see and monitor all the things that our automation is doing. We'll get into, and we get into talking about various activities. We'll talk about the write line and our log message activities that are available. As we execute those activities, the results from those two activities will show up in our output window. So simply a way to just really, it's our vision of what is our automation doing from the developer point of view, being able to see what those messages that we'll talk about it in further detail in future videos, what's going on with our automation. Similar to output, being able to get into error lists, additional detail when we run our automation, being able to do find references, as well as we'll get into a topic of breakpoints, being able to stop the code as it's executing. This is a way to quickly be able to get back to some of those breakpoints. So the properties window, you'll notice there's not a whole lot going on here yet. When we bring in our first couple activities, we'll get into the details here. But this window on the right, as we bring activities in and place them into our automation, this right window over here, properties window, depending on the activity that you bring in, it's our job as developers to custom tailor the individual activities to make them work in our automation. It's this properties tab here on the right that allows us as developers to be able to modify the way those various activities work in our larger case automation. So all the things that we have to configure, set up in order for the activity to properly behave and function. And those specific settings will show up in this right pane over here. We have not yet talked about the pane here at the top, and you'll notice in particular this hopefully starts again looking more like what you'd see in more of your Microsoft Office, your ribbon tab that you'd see when you're in Word or Excel or PowerPoint, etc. In this case, on the far left, the ability to create new sequence flowcharts, state machines, or global handlers. This is yet again one way that you can create your new sequences, flowcharts, etc. Probably the more common way, though, would be to come back here to the project tab. If you do a right click, you've got the ability to add new folder sequences, flowcharts. Here it is, adding in folder sequence flowchart. Being able to do it this way. Again, it's a case where there's multiple ways to accomplish the same task. I would say what I'm demonstrating here is probably a slightly more common way of going about that, as opposed to using the new option up above. One thing that you'll get into, notice with the ability to add a new folder. Once you get into some of your bigger projects, the use of folders in here to group all of your XAML files that you're going to create. When we talk XAML files, sequence, flowcharts, state machines, these will create new XAML files in your existing projects. So a very common thing that we'll get into talking about later down the road, especially when we start getting into the RE framework conversations at a later point. Again, as you're modifying your files here, similar to what you see in Microsoft Office, the ability to actually save your XAML files, so being able to save what you're currently working on. The ability to take the XAML file that you have or your current project and being able to export it as a template, so similar to what we talked about back on the home page here, being able to build a template. You're able to take an existing project and export your project as a template here. Once we're ready to actually execute and run our automation, that's where this debug file prompt comes into play. So notice there's an option for debug, run, and run file. Anytime that you really want to be able to test your application, that's where we use the debug option here. So this allows you to test a single XAML file at a time. If you're, let's say you're in a second or third XAML file outside of main, it will simply test that single file that you're in. And as we dig into some of the project work later on in our course, we'll experiment and play with some of these activities, but it's specifically calling out debugging the current project as opposed to debugging, in this case, the current file that we're in. When we talk about run or run file, this is going to treat it more as if you're running it on a server side or seeing what the automation would look like running outright and not necessarily in a testing phase. And notice, we'll talk about the debug tab here in a minute. So once we get into this debug mode, there's a whole tab with many more properties and options that are available. So I'll talk about this in just a moment as well. Notice cut, copy, and paste. So that when we do have our activities out here and we're modifying and adjusting our automation, we've got the ability to cut, copy, and paste the activities in and around what we're currently developing. Calling out the managed packages. Recall a moment ago I had discussed this. This again being the second option that we have available. Here we're talking about it in context with the dependencies here. It's through this interface here that allows us to bring in additional activities that aren't necessarily out of the box. So what I mean by out of the box, the default activities that are always brought in. Take for an example, if you had to do something around the use of a PDF, we've got the ability to, we'll type in UiPath.pdf. See if we can find, might be UiPath team. Here we go, UiPath team.pdf.extension.activities. This allows us to bring in additional PDF activities that by default aren't necessarily part of the original dependencies that were brought in. So if I needed to do some additional work with PDF files, I've got the ability to install this package here. Same thing here if you got additional needs for various things. If you do some Google searching around, you'll find different packages that you're able to ultimately pull in and incorporate into your automation. One thing to pay attention to here is the settings tab here. What I always try to tell people is if you're really out searching, make sure all these checkboxes are checked. You may have some different ones depending on how your organization has Studio set up and configured, but it's through here that these are the different websites or locations in which these packages are searchable and can be found. This project dependencies, again, you notice here, this is the same one that is in our current project here. And then obviously all packages, this is where you can begin to search and pull in additional packages to be pulled in to our environment here. And again, this is really looking at each of the individual libraries that we saw inside of our settings window a moment ago. And this is again the way we can bring in additional activities via packages to be included in our automation. Then working our way across, notice here this ability of recording. This would be similar to trying to do what a macro recorder would attempt to do inside of Word or Excel, etc. Me personally, I would highly suggest or recommend that we don't use this if we don't have to. It's you're not necessarily going to get the most robust or stable automation design. When you build these automations, if you can do the development on your own, you're going to be able to custom tailor these and tweak them exactly to your needs. When you get into playing with the recorder, it's going to attempt to bring in the activities that it believes it ultimately needs to pull in, but you're most likely going to get a lot of extra miscellaneous content into your automation that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily need if you were to go at your development alone and independently outside of the recorder. But no, this is an option available to you. It's going to attempt to walk you through some of the capabilities that way. Outside of the activities that we talked about a moment ago right here, here's a couple of canned, I'll call them wizards. that are available to us that UiPath attempts to walk us through in the way of being able to scrape data. Again, you could attempt to do this, otherwise you can really get a bit more specific if you pull in the various activities that also accomplish the ability of a screen scrape. Data scraping, however, might be an activity that you may ultimately use. You'll notice here as you hover over it, it's talking about the ability to extract structured data from a browser application or other document specifically into what we call a data table. Data tables will make a lot more sense later on in our coursework. It's really a data table is nothing more than conceptually UiPath's version of an Excel spreadsheet, or if you get into more your technical detail, a SQL Server type table. It's a rows and column store that lives inside of UiPath Studio. That is, again, reminiscent to what you'd see in an Excel spreadsheet, but specifically that idea of a structured data from browser application or documents. So think of a table inside of a web page, so rows and columns of data living inside of a web page, or in this case, a Word document or PDF file. Being able to extract that data and then store it inside of UiPath as a formal structured data table, or a formal table inside of Studio. That notion of data table again will make a bit more sense in a future lesson and activity that we will discuss in great detail. Again, another one of your wizard type capabilities as it pertains to some of the various user events as well. This button for UI Explorer is the exact same that we saw a moment ago back in the Home tab here for UI Explorer. So we already discussed that a moment ago. In this case, being able to remove unused variables, so a bit of a cleanup housekeeping item that is made available to us inside of UiPath Studio. Analyzing files, again, exporting to Excel. There's activities that we can get into in the details here. And last but not least, this ability to publish. As you hover over this, you notice it's got the ability to publish the package to Orchestrator. So as you begin to work towards a actual deployment of our automation, it's through this case of publishing our automations, as you see here, talking about sending your package, or in this case code, if you will, up to the Orchestrator to get it ready for more of a server-side deployment. At that point, that's where this publish process becomes an available option to us. Last but not least, in the way of our tabs, again, we've talked about the debug options of being able to debug the file. Notice it's the same play button that we saw back on the design. If we were actually executing code and debugging code, we could get into the various aspects here. If it was running, the stop button here would be available to us, which would simply, as it says, would stop our automation from currently running. If we had a issue or a problem, or if we set a breakpoint in the application, these additional options here, stepping into, over, out, retrying, ignoring, or restarting would become available to us as well. So this simply is talking about how do you want the code to execute from one activity to the next as you're in more of a debug mode here. Again, we talked about the ability to set breakpoints. So setting breakpoints more or less talks about if you have an activity that you want code to execute up to, but then pause before executing that specific activity, we can set what we call a breakpoint on that specific activity. So when we go to run our automation, the code will run up to, but stop when that quote breakpoint is hit. This idea of slow step, it's actually a toggle button here. In this case, you see it says off, 1x, 2x, 3x, 4x, and then off again. This is simply talking about how fast will the code step through activity by activity inside of our editor here when we get into debug mode. So if it's off, you won't see any of the step-by-step, but if an issue does develop or if a breakpoint is set, the code will stop at that point. But if you actually want to see where it's at in execution from a step-by-step point of view, the more times you set the multiplier here, 1x, 2x, 3x, 4x, 1x being the slowest step, so it moves by really, really slow. By the time you go to 4x, the code's going from activity to activity relatively quickly, but still in a view that you're able to see activity to activity as opposed to it being simply off at that point. The other cool thing to call out here is the ability to highlight elements so that stepping through, if it gets to an activity that it's getting ready to click on, being able to type text into, or it's interfacing with some type of control or interface on the overall user interface. This idea of highlighting an element will actually draw a red box around what it is that UiPath is currently in its scope of execution, getting ready to do or to accomplish. So one of the other cool features that is readily available to us. When we get into our automation, which we are about to do, there are a couple other additional options down here on the bottom that we're not going to get into extensive detail on at this point, but I wanted to call out this ability in here to call out the ways of being able to create what we call variables, which will be our next lesson that we will dig into and start discussing. This idea of arguments, which we'll also discuss in a future activity and lesson. And then this idea of imports, which is similar to what we were looking at with our dependencies. These are additional activities that we can bring in and incorporate into our automation. So all the various added capabilities that are available to us that we can bring in and include into our overall automation at that point. So it's time to build our first little mini automation inside of Studio to simply demonstrate the capabilities of some of the activities. And what I would recommend we do here is we'll bring two different activities in. The first one that I would like us to do simply a write line activity. So if you search for write line, you'll notice here available system activity statements, write line. You can see I've used this recently. It's also my favorites window or favorites category. Simply grab the activity here. So notice I'm on the activity tab, typed in write line in the search, bring write line and drop it in as an activity here. You'll notice the activity is on the screen. What I had talked about a moment ago in the properties, these are all the things that the write line activity can do for us. In this case, you notice the text. Every activity is going to have a little bit different of an experience as to what the capabilities are on the screen here. But at this rate, with the write line activity, notice text here is also the same as the text box. So the ability to do the same thing in two different spots. If I begin typing in here, once I leave here, the text will show up here, and vice versa. If I start typing here, the text again would show up at this spot here. What's cool with the properties of any of the activities that we bring in, if you mouse over any of these individual properties, individual items here, it'll start to actually walk you through what this specific thing does. So in this case, it says the text to display. What do you want to have displayed on the screen when this activity runs? What it's going to do, it's going to write text out. In this case, you heard me mention before, specifically to that output window. So we're going to see that action occur in just a moment. We, again, haven't discussed variables and data types yet. This will be part of our next activity. But it's also telling us here the ability of what type of data, in the way of data type, is going to be generated. In this case, it says string, which implies to us is of type text. So being able to type in some type of text value is what it's looking for here. So we are simply going to, in quotes, anytime we're dealing with string variable, 98% of the time I will call out in future lessons and activities when we do not use quotes for text and string-based data. But anytime we do use, majority of the time, again, 98%, we will always use quotes. I would simply want to say, hello, world. And if I again click off here, you'll notice hello world text, as I said, would show up in our top corner here. We have officially built our first automation. Notice we've added some code here. Notice the star. This is implying that this specific XAML file, in our case main, has not yet been saved. I want to go back to the design tab and save. Notice the star has now gone away. Our file has been saved. We can't lose any of our work at this point. I can now hit the debug current file. So if I hit play here, I'm actually running my automation for the first time. And as I do this, nothing super exciting is going to happen other than if I go to my output window, you'll notice it says, hello world. This text on the screen is coming from what we just did right here. Notice also this output window, as I clicked on it, it is kind of floating around out here. It's in kind of a, what we call a float state. It's ideal to have this docked. This is a common enough window that, as I say docked, these other windows, notice, are locked in place. If I right click in this blue bar here, it gives me the ability to click dock here. Now this window shows up like the other ones. It's in kind of a locked view where it's always easily and readily accessible. So hello world, again generated by our right line activity right here. Another quick little demo before we call this wraps would be to do a message box activity. And if I bring in the system dialog message box, let's put it right below our right line. You could put it above, it doesn't matter. Very similar to right line. Notice it's talking about text again. A few different properties here. We're not going to get into the details of them here, but notice we could put buttons on our box here. We could put a caption on the box, text in this case, as well as some additional, being able to talk about what buttons were pressed as output. Notice in this case it's of type string again. Output argument is, so the result's going to come to us in text. Maybe in a future activity or lesson we'll talk about some of the details around message box. But again, in quotes, let's simply type in hello world again. As soon as I click off, you notice I had the little blue dot here a moment ago. It's trying to tell us we're missing something. We need to complete the activity in order for the automation to be able to run. In this case, I've sufficed it with the text. Notice the text property here is talking about object, which is a bit more of a generic variable type we'll talk about in the next activity. But again, what I type here shows up here. I would have done the same if I typed here and vice versa. So if I save and run again, you'll notice the hello world will still show up in my output window. But hopefully this time around, I also see a message box that shows up on the screen. So this little box here, it's been driven based on this activity. Notice hello world again. That's the specific text that has been generated. So congratulations on building your first automation. And this concludes the tutorial of UiPath Studio. Look forward to catching you in our next lesson.